Yes, this is the comic scene. The reason why we call this segment the comic scene is because in 1981, StarLog did create a sister magazine. StarLog was really pumping them out for a while. Different magazines of various interests. They made Future Life was a magazine based on more science fact. They realized that there was a need for a professional critique of quality comic books. Therefore, they developed the comic scene. And in the issue number one of Comic Scene, there's a title about fandom and how fandom was developing on a greater level. And the convention scene was getting bigger and bigger, and people started collecting comics and were coming out in large numbers to support the creators and to find out more about them.
So this article was actually written by the, one of the co-founders of Creation Con, which is a con that started in the 70s that is still very popular today. I mean, it is a huge con. They sponsor, or they have the largest Star Trek convention, and they also have supernatural cons and other genre shows. So the article it's called Fandom, the Phenomenon, 1965 to 1981. 81 was the year, of course, that this was written. And what is it you're saying? Yes, they
By
are by Adam Malin. That was his name. Yes, the co-creator of Creation.
It's interesting his observations how the science fiction fandom had been growing, and there were some successful mediums for expressing people getting together for regarding science fiction and fantasy, meeting the creators and things of that sort. But it was growing within time because people were starting to save their items. And by the time this article was written in 1981, the Silver Age had gone by. So can you imagine what a comic convention would have been like back then? There would have been a plethora of Silver Age comics available.
There would have been a lot, yes, because I mean, well, there wasn't as much, miscellaneous merchandise around back then. So you have these dealers that have all of these older comics. I mean, if anybody was able to save them, or if it was like probably comic stores like that still had some issues that they never did sell, so they bring them to these comic conventions and
Hmm.
try to sell them, and the fans just loved it. They could just go there and find, oh wow, look, it's this and this, it's an old Superman issue, yay!
And it's now let's just because this is our introduction episode. I have to ask you, growing up, DC or Marvel?
I was always DC. One of my things was, well, I mean, because you have the Saturday morning cartoons, Super Friends was one of my favorite shows. So I preferred the comics with Superman and Wonder Woman, the DC comics. That was always my thing. So for you, Puddin', what was your favorite?
Definitely Marvel.
Oh, of course. We had to be different in some way, didn't we?
But when I really started getting into comics, because I remember one of the early comics that I got was the Star Wars comics when they came out, and there was a large green rabbit called Jax, and I found that fascinating, how the Star Wars universe expanded. I remember getting early on, it must have, some of the comics of my early comics, I don't remember choosing them. So my grandfather would just get them for us. And I don't really think that there was any thought involved. But one of the first comics that I remember specifically choosing for myself was a DC comic. It was the Origins of the Teen Titans, Cyborg, that came out in 1981. So we have
Okay,
something we could
I
talk
do
about.
remember Teen Titans. Yes, seems like it was sometime in the 80s when I bought the first Teen Titans issue. I mean,
Mhm.
yes, and it talked about their origins as being an offshoot of or being in the first issue. It seemed like they were rejected by the Super Friends, and so these teens formed their own group. And yes, I remember that. It was a great story, and there's going to be a live action TV series based on that. Can't wait to see it.
Yeah, that's going to be exciting. But it's interesting that this article about fandom, the phenomenon, went on to talk about how these creation co-founders, Adam Malin and Berman, got together and realized that science fiction fans are more than likely also comic book fans. They had the insight to realize that if you like one thing, you probably like another thing. And that's one of the things we're going to keep referring back to StarLog. Early issues of StarLog had on the back covers, they had advertisements for Kiss albums, for Angel. They realized that if you liked one type of thing, you probably like another type of thing. And that was the goal with making comic book conventions on a larger scale and making them multimedia. This particular convention that they're referring to, that was put together in Manhattan, they were smart enough to get George Lucas involved and have previews of, and also the Spielbergs, to showcase some of the sneak peeks of the movies that they were making. So it was like the forerunner of what they do now at
At San
San
Diego,
Diego Comic
yes,
Con.
having the preview of the movies. But of course, back then it seems like it was always in the larger cities where they had these. So I still, for me, I feel like,
Hmm.
oh, I missed it. Oh well. But they had those huge cons in the larger cities. And another interesting thing here is that the fans, there were fans who grew up going to cons, and they eventually became professionals themselves. They would work, some of them became like special effects artists for movies, or they became
Yes,
writers but they made their own novels that got published. I mean, so now we have the fandom sort of creating itself, because you have the people who started out as fans that became professionals and would appear at cons as guests and speak to the new fans now.
yes,
And so the fandom kept growing in that way.
yes. It mentions that John Byrne, Dave Cockrum, Frank Miller, all these what we would consider giants in the comic book professional industry, they were all fans. They would attend conventions. They wanted to get to meet the people that were the creators. And this sparked their interest in getting involved on a professional level. And it's like that today. How many times have you heard of instances where creators would meet a fan and critique their work and be able to make connections for professionals? So early on, this type of convention, it wasn't just about buying, selling, but it was also nurturing the next generation of professional creators.
And some of this is still going on today. You have like my first Dragon Con in '91. They had Piers Anthony was a guest, the
Oh, that's
sci-fi
amazing. Yeah.
writer, and he actually took ideas from the audience. I mean, people. I mean, he said, if you want to give an idea for like a plot or story, uh, let me know. And then like if someone would give an idea that he liked, he would say, no, make sure you give your name to my friend over here who's taking notes so that we can give you credit for it.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, he was very nice to do that, and the fans loved it. I mean, so they, the professionals catering to the fans and encouraging us. That's what we want.
And that's one of the reasons why we love fan-run conventions so much. We go to conventions of all different sizes, but to have that one-on-one time with the creators especially is exciting.
Yes, and getting to meet them, right? You at a con, you go to these professionals, the artists, and you can just talk to them. You go up to their table and you can just talk and have a conversation. And most of them are like they're so happy to meet the fans, and they're wonderful. They're friendly. They most of them really like talking to the fans, and that's an experience that we always enjoy.
I like this paragraph, and it speaks about how some fans, because of the connections that they made at conventions, ended up making a career themselves. Notice this. People like Tom Savini, a stuntman with deep fan roots, secretly longed to act, but also loved makeup and prosthetic effects for films. His alliance with George Romero for Dawn of the Dead, previewed by Romero himself at Creation in New York some time ago, made his name a household word in fan circles. Then came Maniac, and finally in Knight Riders he had a considerable chance to act as well as create special effects. Now he's going into directing, a multi-talented guy. Then there was Howard Chaykin, who used to struggle from convention to studio trying to get work for his developing talent. Today, Chaykin is a premier artist whose work has been seen literally by millions of people. Another fan turned pro. So it's always wonderful to meet other fans at conventions as well. I mean, that's one of our favorite things to do.
Yes, meeting other people who are just like us, who love going to cons. We talk to them and find out, like, hey, there are other people like us out there, and which was, like, people that you don't normally meet in everyday life, and you can see all these people at cons. It's all these people that you have the fandom in common with. It's one of the great things about going to cons.
Yeah, it mentions here, you got to figure this was back in 1981. And I've noticed quite often in this particular issue of the comic scene, a variety of articles constantly refers to that today's fans are very sophisticated. So it mentions how the sophisticated fan not only collects comic books, but the new formats of media, such as videotapes. Do you remember going to conventions and seeing rows and rows and rows of videotapes?
The video cassettes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, yeah, and they might still have them sometimes. I mean, some people still, want to watch something on their VCR. But yeah, it was the thing back then, yes, and it was, yeah, in '81 it was still new.
We didn't have a VCR. We certainly did.
Yeah, I didn't until yeah, later in the '80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was, and so that was a highlight at conventions, is because not everybody did have VCRs, but it mentions how different video presentations were presented at comic book conventions. Do you remember that being? It seemed like it was a constant. Where the Star Trek blooper reels, how that was a big event. People would show up in the auditorium to see that on the big screen.
Yes, yeah. You could watch the bloopers because there was no YouTube back then. I mean, and this was the only way we could watch them. And I think that, like, they weren't even available for sale back then, right? It was just you just could watch them at cons. So it was just a great thrill to always see those. Even though, and like for Star Trek, it was the same ones over and over, but we still loved it.
Yes. It's interesting because you got to figure in 1981, this is a question that was brought up because by that point, 1981, we were seeing comic book stars on TV fairly often. We both watched Wonder Woman and The Incredible Hulk and the different Saturday morning cartoons. Well, it asks, and what of television itself? How will it affect sci-fi and fantasy fans? Already, we are watching movies via videocassette or cable networks. It seems the day of these great three networks is coming to a close. Certainly, they never really cared about the emotional attachment we, the viewing public, had for sci-fi, fantasy, or much of the TV drivel of the last 20 years would not have been created. The occasional series that was good got the positive qualities from its producer and actors and production people, not the networks. They only cared about ratings. But with cable and videocassettes, fans have greater flexibility to choose quality programming once and for all. And people like Fred Silverman lose their jobs. When it came time to get videotapes, what were some of the first ones that you got?
I got the Star Trek episode Journey to Babel. That was one of my first video cassettes.
Did you remember they only came one episode per tape?
I know, and you think about it now, it's hilarious because if you wanted every episode of Star Trek, it would fill up a whole bookcase.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, back then, yeah.
And what else were some of your favorites?
Another show that I really liked was Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. That was just
what
like...
What about it that you love Buck Rogers so? I mean, it seems like every Dragon Con you have to go see the Buck Rogers panel, too.
And
why Buck?
I mean, you always have to make fun of me even for liking that show. I mean, doesn't everyone like it? I don't know why you didn't like that one. But, You know what? When
It's
it
not
when
that
it
I
came
didn't
out,
like it. It's definitely it's not that I didn't like it. I definitely did not like it to the level that not only that you did like it, but you still like it.
it was, yeah, it's just something that made that impact on me back then. It must have been just the right time for me. The cool, handsome Buck Rogers with his witty remarks, and the beautiful ladies with their glamorous costumes, and all of the costumes and the colors on the show, the special effects, the scenery, the lighting. They had like a lot of white backgrounds with all the flashy colors. Oh, it was just
Hmm.
cool. It was really cool.
It was pretty um, imaginative in so many ways. I got a kick out of Twiki.
Tweaky, yes. It was probably more of a show of aesthetics and probably not as much for plots, maybe. But I mean, but it was just perfect for me back then. And so it like when you loved it as a child, I mean, it's like yeah, I mean, I still love it.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.